Of all the casual conversations that crop up in Final Fantasy communities through the years, the question of which Final Fantasy location you'd most like to live in is definitely up there among the most asked. And despite its often divisive reception, Final Fantasy VIII's world is almost always in the running as a most desirable locale. So why is this? What is it about Final Fantasy VIII's world and setting that remains so alluring, and indeed unique, when set aside almost every other world in the series? Jumping right in and looking at Final Fantasy VIII's introduction, it's here that we see the first glimpse of how different this world and setting is going to be. After an action-packed opening montage, we wake up in the scenic surrounds of Balamb Garden's infirmary. A curtain blows in a small breeze, sun beams in from outside, and only the sound of birdsong can be heard. It's a serene introduction to the game that contrasts starkly with the tense drama of most other game introductions, which often thrust us into the flux of action and battle, whether that's kidnapping Princess Garnet, infiltrating the Shinra reactor, or fleeing the forces of Niflheim. Indeed, the scene following the infirmary, which sees us walk alongside Quistis into Balamb Garden proper, trades entirely on the scenic appeal of the location, as the camera pans out across the quad, showing students at leisure, going about their day, the peaceful Uematsu score for Balamb Garden plays, and an exterior shot shows Balamb Garden in all its splendour, set against clear blue skies. Final Fantasy VIII quite uniquely makes an effort in this opening hour or so to establish itself as a welcoming, scenic locale, and since for many players the opening few hours of a game are what establishes it in their mind and becomes that initial core memory of a game experience, it's often what sticks in the mind and what they think of when they are reminded of Final Fantasy VIII's setting. So, a very nice opening there of Balamb Island, Balamb Garden and Balamb Town, comprising the initial island that we are confined to, and it's only really the Fire Cavern which sticks out like a sore thumb in this opening stanza of gameplay, precisely because of how it contrasts so starkly with these other locations, being an ominous, lava-strewn setting, a dungeon that is at complete odds with everything else on Balamb Island. Taking a step back and looking more broadly at the world of Final Fantasy VIII, another reason it's so perpetually inviting is that, unlike most other Final Fantasy titles, there is, on the surface at least, less overt environmental danger or environmental threat that is obvious in the world. For example, where Final Fantasy VII has the dystopian bleakness of Shinra's presence in the world, and later the looming meteor fall, Final Fantasy IX has the mist monsters scouring the world and a world that's perpetually covered in mist. Final Fantasy X has sin, and other titles like 15 and 16 have various types of blight or disease that bring monsters and ruin to the world. And Final Fantasy VIII, by contrast, has nothing so obvious as this to disrupt or haunt its world. I've gone so far as to describe the game as solarpunk in the past, which isn't quite correct terminology, but it is certainly more utopian compared to other worlds in the Final Fantasy games. There is very advanced, efficient infrastructure, such as the unique train service that runs across the world, and is one of the only instances of a train service we see like this in a Final Fantasy overworld. There is advanced civilizations like Esthar, scenic, homely locales such as Dole, Delling City, Windhill and Balamb Town, that, rather than having slums or oppression or overt social disparity, actually have a degree of affluence and good vibes about them. And even Timber, which sits under Galbadian occupation through the events of the game, has a certain vibe about it, in the music, in the demeanour of the people, that isn't wholly negative or oppressive. That being said, Final Fantasy VIII does of course have its share of threats. Firstly, there is the geopolitics that very much thrusts much of the initial story forward, the Galbadian aggression, and this is man-made. It's not something that's inherently a product of the environment. But more pressingly than that, and much more organic and environmental, is the periodic lunar cry, which is known to be an existential threat, having destroyed the Centra civilization in centuries past, causing monsters to rain from the moon and appear in the world. But I would say, unlike, for example, Sin in Final Fantasy X, which is a very real and constant threat that prevents civilization from advancing in Spira, the lunar cry is much more remote, much more infrequent, and something more akin to an earthquake, perhaps. We don't have citizens around the world fretting about it constantly, and it hasn't prevented mankind from moving on, industrializing and advancing. So the lunar cry, I would say, lacks the same constant presence and bleakness that other things cause in worlds such as Final Fantasy X, which again adds, I think, to the overall coziness of Final Fantasy VIII's world. Finally, turning to structure and gameplay, Final Fantasy VIII is unique in how it's structured, albeit subtly, around missions rather than dungeons, and in a far cry from other titles where we end up in dingy caves or basements fighting bats and ghosts and tonberries and things like that, whether that's Gizmaluke's Grotto in Final Fantasy IX, Train Graveyard in Final Fantasy VII, or the dungeon-rich overworld of Final Fantasy XII, the vast majority of Final Fantasy VIII's gameplay revolves around these affluent cities and townships, whether that's the Delling City assassination mission, the siege of Dole, infiltrating Balamb Town, or indeed liberating Fisherman's Horizon. It's another way that this game is similar, I think, to the likes of Final Fantasy X, which likewise dialed down on dungeon crawls in favour of puzzle quests such as the Cloister of Trials. And aside from optional dungeons like the Deep Sea Research Facility or Central Ruins, it's only really the Fire Cavern, the Delling City Sewers, and the D-District Prison, and little bits like that, that really lean into this traditional sense of a dungeon crawl in Final Fantasy VIII proper. So how this works to make the world feel more cosy is that it basically removes and alleviates that sense of dread or drudgery caused by bleak dungeon locations that we find in other JRPGs, other Final Fantasy games. And by turns, this of course amplifies the good vibes of the nice locations, these overworld towns and cities that we generally spend most of the game in. So it's these factors of story chronology and gameplay structure that work hand in hand to emphasise the positive vibes of the setting in both overt and subtle ways, leaving players, and perhaps even those that don't rank Final Fantasy VIII necessarily highly, with a lasting impression of Final Fantasy VIII as a cosy, inhabitable, aspirational world. And finally, of course, I would be remiss not to mention the fantastic score by Nobuo Uematsu, because of course in these games that relied on pre-rendered backgrounds, no voice acting and things like that to really communicate emotion, I think it was his compositions, and particularly the compositions for these key locations, that really drove home the affable, welcoming nature of them. For example, the Balamb Garden theme, the Balamb Town theme, Fisherman's Horizon. These are some of the standout fan favourite tracks that appear in Final Fantasy VIII, and really did a lot to double down on that coziness and sense of utopian warmth that Final Fantasy VIII ultimately conveys. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the episode, please consider joining me on Patreon. Alternatively, if you feel like donating me a coffee, you can do so. The links are available below.